Our second reading is from the book of Ephesians. Be careful then how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of time, because the days are evil. So not to be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, as you sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs among yourselves, singing and making melody to the Lord in your hearts, giving thanks to God the Father at all times and for everything, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. This is the word of the Lord.
So every summer, I feel like I have a great opportunity to make the most of the days ahead. Even though it's hot and humid and the days are long, I have got extra daylight, so I can take walks with Blake and cook out on the deck. The days are good, and I try to make the most of them. I feel the same way about vacations. I am one of those people, and sometimes people find this very obnoxious, but I like to plan out in excruciating detail all the places I'm going to go, all the things I'm going to do, all the people I'm going to see, because after all, I want to make the most of the days I have on vacation. Vacation days are good, and I try to make the most of them. And in August, even when I am not on vacation, lots of other people are. And so, it's relatively quiet around church. I can get a lot of planning done and catch up on a lot of stuff that will be harder to do once we're back in the fall schedule. At least, this is the theory, if I can get my act together. Some of these middle weeks of August are relatively light for me, and that's a good thing. So I try to make the most of them. Almost always, when days are good, I try to make the most of them. Maybe this is true for you as well. And perhaps that is what creates such cognitive dissonance for me when I read the first line of today's reading from Ephesians. Make the most of the time, because the days are evil. That is, take advantage of these days because they're bad. And that is not usually the way things work in my life. When things are bad, I'm often too distracted to focus on anything other than the problems in my life. A few months ago, when Blake got diagnosed with his spinal disease, I was so overwhelmed with that diagnosis that there were a bunch of things I was trying to do around the house and get done, and they all just dropped away. I just couldn't focus on anything else. It's hard to make the most of the days when the days are bad. When things are stressful, I'm often too exhausted to do anything more than absolutely what I need to in order to get through the day. I've watched a number of my friends going through some particularly rough times lately, and I try to help and I try to walk with them through it. But often, just getting through the trauma of the moment is all any of us can do. It's hard to make the most of the days when the days are so stressful. And when things are chaotic around me, it is really hard for me to be efficient and take advantage of any opportunities, even if I see them. I remember back in the early days of the pandemic, it was all we could do just to keep up with the ever almost daily changing rules that the state and the county set for what we were allowed to do, and to figure out how we were going to make worship accessible using whatever we actually had at the moment. It took until we got more into a routine and things were less chaotic before we could kind of step back, reassess, and think about how we could make things better. And that's because it's often hard to make the most of the days when the days are so chaotic. Maybe you feel the same way. It's just easier to make the most of the days when the days are good. But it's hard to make the most of the days when the days are bad, even evil. And maybe that is why the letter to the Ephesians makes this point. It's often tempting to say, at least I think this a lot, even if I don't let the words come out of my mouth, you know, the days are bad, stressful, or chaotic right now. I will wait for better days to look for God's opportunities and then make the most of them. After all, it's certainly easier to make the most of days when the days are not evil. But for most of us, the days are not always good. Life is filled with bad events, stress, and chaos. And that is true for us not only personally, but for the community in which we live and the life of the world around us. And so Ephesians encourages us not to wait for a better day, especially when the day we have right now seems evil. Instead, we're reminded that our call as Christians is to see Jesus' presence in our lives at all times, even when the days are bad, and to be people who engage in the struggle to, as the writer says, give thanks to God the Father at all times and for everything. In my life, and maybe in yours too, that is not always an easy thing. But we're reminded in this letter that making the most of the days is never so necessary or important for the life of the world around us than when things are bad, even evil. It's in those bad days full of problems into which Jesus calls us to be his physical presence of help. It's in those bad days of stress that Jesus calls us to be a sign of hope. It's in those bad days of chaos that Jesus calls us to be light in the midst of the darkness. As many of you may recall from our annual meeting, we made it financially in 2020 in spite of the pandemic and its effect on our income. Yay! Now, partially, this was due to the fact that we were able to access the Payroll Protection Program, which supplemented our ability to pay salaries and utilities. We didn't know how bad giving might be, but giving, while worse than usual, was not as bad as we first expected it might be. And at the end of the year, as we reported at the annual meeting, our actual income slightly exceeded our actual expenses. And so council, because of this, said, we should do something. And council realized that we should make a difference in the lives of those in our community who were not so fortunate. So last month, we decided to send an extra donation of $15,000 to the Upper Montgomery Assistance Network, which is one of our partners in the county that we regularly support anyway, which assists people with rent and utilities. We knew that this was a bad time for a lot of folks in our community as eviction moratoriums are ending. And so now is a time when it is most important for Christians to make the most of the bad days by doing something that makes a good and visible difference in the lives of our neighbors. Make the most of the day because the days are bad. This past week, I have been watching a series of video seminars put together by several ELCA synods in the Western United States. They're intended to help all of us think through some of the ways that we can grow ministry in hybrid ways. That is, neither going back to the ways that things were in 2019 before the pandemic, which frankly often were not working, nor simply doing stuff online, which is what we were forced to do last year. One of the pastors leading these seminars reminded us that we all got into this COVID situation right before Easter 2020. Even churches resistant to technology, because it was Easter, they had to find new ways to connect to people during Easter. It was hard, and the days were bad. But this pastor told us that the data now shows that because so many people tuned in to church services on Easter 2020 to see how churches would actually manage this, that more people than had ever shown up for Easter services live watched Easter online, which means that because of the bad situation that we were in and our willingness to act in the midst of a bad situation, more people than ever in the United States heard the message of the resurrection of Jesus and were given hope in the midst of a time where people really needed hope. The days were bad, and because churches acted, people heard hope. And now, we have to find new ways of doing things. Things that were neither the way we did them in 2019, nor the ways we did them in 2020 when we had to be all online. And yet, now we have the Delta variant causing new chaos in our country, And it would be just so much easier if we could just wait until things were more settled. But there's always going to be some kind of chaos going on. And it's precisely in the midst of the chaos that Jesus most needs us not to duck and cover. We need to try things. We need to experiment. We need to be willing to fail even, which is always hard for me, but we need to be willing to fail so that we can figure out what will work and what won't. As I said to some people earlier this week, I said, we have to be willing to actually do some things where we say, maybe the way we start doing some things in our fall programming in September is not at all like how we're going to end up doing them in May, and we're going to have to adapt as we go along. Because it's precisely when the days are bad and stressful and chaotic that we most need to step up and try. We're not really sure why the days were evil for the Ephesians, but it really doesn't matter. The Ephesians were reminded that their faithfulness and willingness to act were never so important as when the days were evil. And I'm not sure I would characterize the days we're living in right now as evil, but they are at very least, shall we say, less than ideal. Even so, the letter to the Ephesians reminds us both as individuals and as a community that days like these are the very days God most needs us to act in faithfulness. We're called to make the most of these days because it's in these problematic days when Jesus most needs us to be helping hands in the lives of others. It's in these days of stress and confusion that Jesus most needs us to be signs of hope. And it's in these days of chaos that Jesus is calling us to be his light in the midst of the darkness that surrounds so many in our world.